Yes. We're going to talk about space and intellectual labor. So it would be helpful to look at the excerpt from A Room of One's Own on that second page, the paragraph starting, "Here then was I." And the setup that we have for A Room of One's Own is that Woolf has been invited to give a lecture at a college on women and fiction. And she starts by telling the story about how she's trying to prepare for this talk, that she's been living with this idea in her daily life. She's been walking around trying to think what it is she's going to share with her audience for the lecture. And she tells the story of being in Oxbridge. Oxbridge is a portmanteau. It's a combined word for Oxford and Cambridge. So she's at the elite universities of England. And she has just started to get an interesting idea about her lecture. And in that passage that I mentioned, she talks about it as being like a little fish. And it's a slippery little fish. And it's kind of disrupting her other thoughts. And she's kind of trying to catch hold of the fish so that this metaphorical thought, so that she can develop it into a lecture. Now, skip ahead to the next page where it says, "But however small it was, it had nevertheless," find that. We're going to read that section because this is central to what she's saying about the challenge of women and fiction or women in any intellectual labor or artistic production, and why women need a room of their own and an independent income in order to do brain work of this kind. So here's what she writes. "But however small it was, the thought, it had nevertheless the mysterious property of its kind. Put back into the mind, it became at once very exciting and important, and as it darted and sank and flashed hither and thither, set up such a wash and tumult of ideas that it was impossible to sit still. It was thus that I found myself walking with extreme rapidity across a grass plot. Instantly a man's figure rose to intercept me. Nor did I at first understand that the gesticulations of a curious-looking object in a cutaway coat and evening shirt were aimed at me. His face expressed horror and indignation. Instinct, rather than reason, came to my help. He was a beetle. I was a woman." And a beetle, if you have read Oliver Twist, a beetle, you know, is often lampooned as a very petty kind of official, like a police officer, someone who is responsible for taking care of other people's behavior, right? Making sure that everything goes the way it's supposed to go. So she is confronted by an Oxbridge beetle who's going to tell her what she's not supposed to be doing. "This was the turf. There was the path. Only the fellows and scholars are allowed here. The gravel is the place for me." Such thoughts were the work of a moment. As I regained the path, the arms of the beetle sank. His face assumed its usual repose. And though turf is better walking than gravel, no very great harm was done. So what does she have to do? Because she's a woman. Yeah, she has to get off the grass. She's a woman. She's not allowed to walk on the grass. She has to get back on the path. Only the male students and professors can walk on the grass at Oxbridge, at Cambridge and Oxford. "The only charge I could bring against the fellows and scholars of whatever the college might happen to be was that in protection of their turf, which has been rolled for 300 years in succession, they had sent my little fish into hiding." So protection of their turf, literally protecting the grass, keep off the grass, but also protecting their turf, right? Their territory, their social and political and intellectual power. And so what does that kind of, that restrictive act against her because she was a woman, what does that do to her thought?
It breaks her thoughts. She talked about the fish is actually her idea, and she talked about feeding the fish.
Mm-hmm.
But if you scare the fish away, it's going to go and you can't feed it anymore. So her idea is like scatter. She can't think because she's still worried about somebody catching her.
Right. It disrupts her intellectual labor. So this becomes an essay all about space and intellectual labor, right? I'm going to ask you to skip ahead a little bit and now go to the paragraph that starts that a famous, actually not quite there yet. We'll find that a famous library has been cursed by a woman. And I'll back it up from there a little bit. So we're going to get the second story of an interruption. So now she's been scared off the grass. She's still thinking about her topic, and she starts to think about Thackeray. Remember, William Makepeace Thackeray was a relative of Virginia Woolf, also a very close friend of Charles Dickens. And she's remembering something strange about one of Thackeray's manuscripts, Esmond, and she remembers that, oh, the actual manuscript is in a library right here in Oxbridge. I've got a question about this manuscript. I could go to the library and look at the original work, and that might actually give me the answer that I'm looking for. And so go to the paragraph above the one that I just noted, and we'll start toward the top of the page. But the affectation of the style, with its imitation of the 18th century, she's talking about Thackeray's writing style, hampers one, so far as I can remember, unless indeed the 18th century style was natural to Thackeray. A fact that one might prove by looking at the manuscript and seeing whether the alterations were for the benefit of the style or of the sense. But then one would have to decide what is style and what is meaning, a question which, but here, I was actually at the door which leads into the library itself. So we're getting her train of thought, so she's like, I'm going to go check out this manuscript and see if it answers my question. I must have opened it, for instantly there issued, like a guardian angel barring the way with a flutter of black gown instead of white wings, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman, who regretted in a low voice as he waved me back that ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. So the black gown represents what? It's the scholar's robes, right? You watch Harry Potter, you get the idea. Traditional colleges in England, the Oxford dons, the professors are going around in their long black robes. And so as she's trying to gain access to the library to look at a manuscript, she is again shooed away. She is excluded. She is not granted access to the space in which to do her intellectual work. Okay, so this is the British Museum. This is where the original British Library was located, and the reading room there was a public space. The British Library is still a closed stack library, which means that you can't take books off the property. You have to check them out in the room, and then you read them in the reading room, take your notes, and then you go away. And Virginia Woolf did work in the reading room. Karl Marx worked there as well as many other Victorian writers and intellectuals. This is the old reading room. It is now a museum. And what you're seeing below the stacks are the tables, the work tables. So Woolf was able to go in, and she had her favorite table. And as you go by the tables, you can see there are little interpretive signs that tell you what famous people like to work there, and you can sit where Karl Marx would sit and work with Frederick Engels. And so she had access, but it was limited. This, by the way, is the new British Library by King's Cross. And a much more kind of egalitarian space. There's the British Library on the left. You can see St. Pancras and then King's Cross. And this is Bateman's. This is the home of Rudyard Kipling, author of Kim and Just So Stories and The Jungle Book and many other works. And so when you think about Woolf's thesis that a woman has to have an independent income in a room of one's own, and you look at the living conditions of many of the writers of her time, Woolf is writing in the Kipling is writing in the early 20th century, late 19th century. This is more of Kipling's house. This little door with the archway on the right goes into his study. Beautiful property. He had a mill house too. And here's Charles Dickens' house again, Doughty Street. We saw this as he's working his way up. So he starts to get more affluent until ultimately Dickens gets Gad's Hill Place. And we remember his study. And we remember those paintings by Dickens' daughter, Katie. So the limited way in which female artistic vision expressed itself in Dickens' home, I think is really interesting. And then we get to Virginia Woolf. So here's Monk's house. We've seen that before. And as you go out the back of Monk's house, past that little conservatory, you go through the orchard, and you're going to see a little church and churchyard out the back of the property. And near there, you'll see the little garden house. And this is where Virginia Woolf wrote at Monk's house. So not only did she have her private bedroom, but she also had her little retreat in the garden house. And there's her writing desk. So the conversations that we've had already about to what extent is private protected space of this kind essential for intellectual labor. And many of you have said, I think quite perceptibly, well, it depends. It depends on like your temperament. It depends on maybe things like whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert, how much quiet you need in your life, right? What kind of stimulation you need. Charles Dickens had a hard time writing outside of cities. He needed kind of the pulse and frenetic energy of a city. So if he went somewhere where it was too quiet, it was very difficult for him. But Woolf sees this as being something that is additionally gendered because of the constraints on women to have private space or uninterrupted space. And I think that this is part of what we're seeing in Orlando. And here's Orlando, or here's the setting for Orlando. This is Knoll. So this is the estate of Thomas Sackville, the Lord Sackville, going all the way back now to the courtier and Thomas Hovey, right, and the Renaissance. Queen Elizabeth visited Knoll, and this estate was passed down through the Sackville West family to, it would have been inherited by Vida Sackville West, and you've noticed that Orlando is dedicated to Vida Sackville West, and it was eventually lost. Vida was not able to retain the property. 20th century death taxes made it prohibitive for most of these large estates to be kept in private families. So you see all of that kind of represented in Orlando's journey. Not only is this a journey from male to female, you get a sense of the scale of Knoll, right? Absolutely massive. There are all those rooms that are getting in the way of Orlando's artistic production, right? There's the deer park, so he can go off with his dogs and be entertained. So Orlando not only changes from male to female, but he also changes from noble to middle class when he loses the property. He changes from kind of child or youth to parent. He changes from like lover to artist. So it's a very kind of complex transformation that has not only gendered valences, but also really important socioeconomic ones. So as you're reading what Orlando understands, how he learns or she changes by the end of the book, consider all of those factors.